Okay, so thanks again for the opportunity to present this morning. I started calling this Creating Images That Inspire, which is actually a shortened version of a longer presentation that I've done, and then I thought I'll put a different twist on it. So really, one of the biggest areas of my competition are smartphones. And when I was up in Sydney 4 weeks ago, getting into Central Station, there was this massive advert plastered all over the place for this new mobile phone that has a 40 megapixel camera in it. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, because my camera is only 36 megapixels. So I thought, well, you know, what makes the difference between somebody with a smartphone and somebody like myself who's a professional with a digital single lens reflex camera? So that's really the context of what I want to talk about this morning, is what makes the difference, if there is indeed a difference. So I think the first thing I want to do is talk about the sorts of things that go into making a great image. And there's three things as I see it. There's composition, there's lighting, and there's post-production. So just to think about composition first of all, there's a thing called framing, where essentially what we're trying to do is frame the subject with something so that the eye is automatically drawn in to look at that particular subject. So in this case here, we've got a house which is under construction, and it's framed with the leaves at the top and with the shadow at the bottom, so you can actually focus in on that particular image. This one here is a reflection of a building which is actually across the street, but again it's framed with the darker areas in the windows, so it actually brings out the elevation of the building that I'm trying to illustrate through that photograph. So can you do that with a smartphone? Yes, of course you can, absolutely. Second thing we might think about are lines and shapes. In photography we've got these things called leading lines, which are essentially lines that lead the eye into the center or the focal point of the image. So in this particular case, which is a building up in Castlemaine, we've got a very strong leading line that takes you into the tower at the end of the building. We have also, in this particular case, very strong lines that lead the eye into the Macedon Valley room, which is up at Macedon there. And then finally, shapes where curves, again, can start to lead the eye into the center of the photograph. So again, can you do that with a smartphone? Yes, of course you can. Absolutely. We then think about patterns and symmetry. Again, trying to make your images interesting through capturing those patterns and symmetry. So symmetry is something, particularly in my line when I'm dealing with architectural photographs, that my clients are looking for. They like everything dead vertical, they like nice perspective, symmetry, etc. And this shot here of Sunshine Station, for example, it takes the eye right through into the centre of the bridge across the railway tracks. And this one here, when we're talking about patterns and colours, is actually the Pixel building in Carlton, I think it is, which is I think it's a 5-star sustainable building. Again, just picking out part of that building to illustrate the essence of what that building is all about. And finally, the arena in Perth, where it's essentially a bike rack, but with a backdrop of very geographical shapes and colour, in contrast to the curves of the bike racks itself, the bits that you tie your bike to. And that's, in a way, exaggerated by the shadow effect from the sun. Again, can you do that with a smartphone? Absolutely. One of the things about composition is also trying to focus in on parts of a building to again illustrate the essence of what that building is about and perhaps tell a story about how it's actually been constructed. This one's Baringo Food and Wine. This one here is from Flinders Street Station before they did all the refurbishment. And this one here is just some brickwork. Again, trying to illustrate the quality of the workmanship that has gone into that particular building. But also taking part of the building to illustrate the way that some of the materials work together. So here we have a very highly detailed timber canopy that's supported with stainless steel. So again, illustrating that juxtaposition between the stainless steel structure and the timber work that's gone into that canopy. This particular one is the art gallery in Auckland. We then think about small spaces, which are probably the most challenging types of space to photograph. Generally, they're bathrooms and toilets. And one of the challenges there is that bathrooms and toilets have mirrors. And mirrors tend to reflect the photographer as well as the surrounds. So one of the challenges there is getting into a position where I'm not actually photographing myself. Can you do this with a smartphone? I'd suggest that we're going to start struggling to get these sorts of images through just a smartphone. And the next thing is light and lighting and the sources. First of all, what sort of sources can we use for our lighting? Obviously daylight. So, you know, we've got a beautiful morning outside, the sun's shining in. Unfortunately, we've drawn the blinds. But in many respects, this sort of lighting for architectural work can actually be really powerful because we get some really nice contrasty light and shade, and it really brings out the texture and the form of the building. So daylight is actually a really good source of light for these sorts of images. But clearly, if I'm taking interiors, then artificial light is going to be the source of light that I'm dealing with. And it's probably not obvious, but the challenge we've got there is the difference between the temperature of daylight versus artificial light. They're entirely different. So photographing an interior in artificial light next to a window, you're going to get it coming through blue because of the difference in the temperature of the daylight. So we've got to start trying to balance all that up. Again, can we start doing some of that stuff with smartphones? Yes, we can. The other thing that we think about is the light and the lighting direction. So here I'm actually shooting into the sun, which, you know, I'm sure when your mother gave you your first camera said, always have the sun behind you. In actual fact, we can start getting some really dramatic shots with actually having the sun in front of us, but we need to be very careful about how we're dealing with that. But what happens there is that we end up with a very high, what we call a high dynamic range, where we have very bright illumination from the sun, potentially some very dark areas because they're in shadow. So again, it depends on the quality of the sensor within the camera. I'm not sure, but maybe some smartphones will be having a bit of a problem trying to get that depth of dynamic range, whereas a camera such as mine can cope with it quite easily, as you can see. And this is just an example of the sort of patterns that we can get through getting the sun in the right position so that we can actually see how the front of that elevation of that building has been modelled. We also think about light and lighting levels. So we can photograph things in the dark. So we've got pretty high contrast there. This particular one of Sunbury Square, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This one was of one of the night shots down at Flinders Street Station when I was doing the progress shots down there. Again, illustrating that even in the dark we can come up with some pretty dramatic shots. And then of course daylight as well. In the middle of the day we can again get some really good contrast between the buildings, and particularly if we've got an interesting sky, you know, nice blue skies with some light blue, light white clouds, as in this particular shot, can add a lot of drama to the picture. So again, can we do that with a smartphone? I would suggest that you probably could. We might start struggling a wee bit when it's in the dark, but I'm sure it can start to deal with that readily. We've also got to think about timing of taking a picture. So this particular building down in Melton, and this shot here was taken first thing in the morning. You can see the sun just at the left-hand side there, just out of picture, which is, you know, quite dramatic. But later on in the day, it changes the whole essence of that image, because we've now got some shadows coming onto the side of the building from the trees and the power lines. And the front of the building, you can see a very definite shadow there as well. As opposed to even later on in the day, where the sun has come round and we've now got a really hard shadow of the power pole right next to it, which really is pretty ugly, as I'm sure you can probably agree. And then later on in the day, when it starts to get a bit dark, then we can start to use the internal lighting of the building to great effect as well. So you can see that from, you know, a spread from sunrise to just after sunset, we're getting 4 entirely different images there. And this is where the skill of a professional photographer starts to come in. Yes, you can take all of those with a smartphone, but one of the skills of a professional photographer is actually knowing when to take the photograph in relation to both the weather and the time of day and sun position, etc. We then need to think about what happens once we've taken the photograph. It's called post-production. And this is a photograph of a refurbished house interior, which you can see quite bright on the left-hand side, pretty dark on the right-hand side. Doesn't make a very good photograph. Whereas when we start playing around with it in Photoshop, after we've taken the photograph, we can actually bring up those shadows, tone down some of the highlights. So again, one of the things that DSLR gives is that we shoot a data file rather than a JPEG, which is what smartphones tend to shoot in. With the data file, we've got a lot of capacity for manipulating that image, whereas with a JPEG, it's quite limited. So here's one of the main advantages of going with a digital SLR. And we can also do other things, for instance, knowing what to shoot, when to shoot, and the direction to shoot in. So again, a professional photographer will take a lot of time in understanding what it is they're going to shoot and do a lot of preparation. This is just an image of some of the preparation that I did for Flinders Street Station progress shots, where the client was looking for specific viewpoints. So on each elevation, I produced a drawing, coded up the viewpoints before I even went on site. So it meant that every time I went back on site, I knew where I was going to be taking the photograph from, and then I was able to code the drawings to the same reference point. So the client could see the image, cross-relate it to the drawing, and understand exactly where it was taken from. So a lot of preparation potentially goes into it. The photography itself can be a lot of fun, and these ones were actually taken by Dean there when we were shooting Sunbury Square. So, you know, it takes a bit of effort making sure that people are out of the way, or you've got people in the right positions, all that sort of stuff. Again, you know, there's a skill there in terms of getting that right for the image that you're looking for. Also processing. You know, I talked about getting the balance of the light and the shadows correct. But, you know, one of the other things we can do, and this is a really extreme example, I'm not suggesting I do it all the time, but this is a building I shot for an architect down in Hampton, I think it was. And you can see there's a lot of ugly stuff hanging around. So through post-production, we can actually start to tidy it up and make it look slightly better by getting rid of all that stuff, okay? As I say, this is an extreme example, and it's not something I would necessarily do all the time. Can you do that on a smartphone? I very much doubt it. So you're still going to have to take your photograph out of a smartphone onto Photoshop and start playing around with it. So there's an extra process there. And then finally, delivery. So the image that we finally deliver to ourselves, if we're the client, or to a client, there are different qualities of image that we can deliver to. So this is an example where this is the equivalent of a 300 pixel per inch photograph. So high quality image, that's something that we would use for printing, for example, as opposed to this one here, and if you compare that plug socket there, much lower resolution at 72 ppi. And that's more an image that you would tend to use for online, so for your Instagrams and things like that. So again, it's understanding how to generate those different qualities of image for the different purposes is really important. So really starting to summarize, there are some differences between smartphones and DSLRs. Is that what makes the difference between I guess a good photograph and a bad photograph? I would suggest not, because I've seen some absolutely awesome photographs taken by a smartphone, as I'm sure we all have, and I'm sure we've all taken some really good photographs. And I've got to admit, occasionally, yes, I do take photographs with my smartphone. So is that what makes the difference? Probably not. So the other question then is the difference between an amateur and a professional? Again, I would suggest not, because you know, some amateurs have got far better equipment than I have and generate some awesome photographs as well. So maybe that's not the difference. So what is the difference between a smartphone, somebody taking a photograph with a smartphone, somebody taking a photograph with a digital SLR? And I thought about this last night, and this is when I was sort of changing my mind about how I was going to slant this particular presentation. And I think the big difference is preparation. When you actually think about people with smartphones, they react to a situation that they're in. They will snap that photograph, as opposed to somebody like myself who will actually plan and prepare and know exactly what they're going to be taking. Some of that may be able to be done by a smartphone, but a lot of it needs to be done by a digital SLR. So that to me is one of the differences. But again, I would also then say is that, if I've got a major architectural practice that want me to go in and photograph their new whiz-bang building, if I rock up there with my smartphone, are they going to be impressed? Probably not. They're going to be more impressed if I rock up there with my big camera, my tripod, and all the other stuff that goes with it. Of course they are. And I've got to say, they will get a better result from that anyway. Of course they will. So an interesting way of looking at it. And I just thought I'd just wind up by trying to wrap that up. Why use a professional? First of all, professionals got the right equipment for the job. They've got the right camera, they've got the right lenses, depending on the genre that they're taking. So, the equipment that I have is specialized for architectural interior photographer. A wedding photographer, for example, would not probably use that equipment. They would have something entirely different. A portrait photographer would have something different. A landscape photographer, something different again. So they've got the right equipment for the job. They have the experience on what to do with light, form, and color. They understand all of those things, and they understand how they work together to generate a really good photograph at the end of the day. And they've got the skills in post-production, being able to take that image from the camera and make it into a really powerful result for the client. Also, project management is being able to manage that photographic project properly, getting the timing right, knowing when and how and all that sort of stuff. But I think really what a professional to me is all about is actually pulling all that together and creating a product and a service that is really going to be beneficial for the businesses that we're going to be taking those images for. So that's all about creating images that will inspire your business to promote itself and for you to generate more business into the future. Thank you very much.